June 26, 2022, a federal jury in New York found the Sackler family's pharmaceutical empire guilty of fraud, marking the first time the architects of America's deadliest opioid epidemic were held criminally accountable. The verdict was the climax of a saga that began in the early 1990s, when a single pill, OxyContin, turned a modest painkiller into a $35 billion empire and a nation's public health nightmare. The story starts with three brothers, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond Sackler, who inherited a modest medical advertising firm and transformed it into Purdue Pharma, a company whose name would soon be synonymous with both innovation and devastation. In 1995, Purdue introduced OxyContin, a time-release formulation of OxyContin marketed as a safer alternative to traditional opioids. Aggressive advertising, lavish payments to doctors, and a relentless promise that the risk of addiction is less than 1% convinced physicians across the country to prescribe the drug for everything from post-surgical pain to chronic backaches. Within a decade, OxyContin prescriptions surged from a few 100,000 to more than 80 million annually. The drug's potency, combined with a misleading narrative of safety, led to a wave of dependence that spread from affluent suburbs to inner-city neighborhoods. By 2017, the United States recorded more than 70,000 opioid-related overdose deaths per year, a figure that would climb to over 100,000 in the following years. The crisis left a trail of shattered families, overburdened emergency rooms, and a nation grappling with an epidemic that seemed to have no end. Behind the headlines lay a web of corporate misconduct. Internal memos leaked in 2005 revealed that Purdue executives were fully aware of OxyContin's addictive potential, yet continued to downplay the risk to regulators and the public. The company funded pain management, conferences that glorified high-dose prescribing, paid kickbacks to physicians in the form of speaker fees and lavish trips, and deployed a sales force that visited doctors up to 3 times a week, delivering glossy pamphlets that touted the drug's low abuse potential. When lawsuits began to mount, Purdue settled in 2007 for $634 million, admitting that it had misled health professionals and patients about the addictive nature of OxyContin. The settlement, however, was only a fraction of the billions earned. More than $11 billion in revenue accrued between 1996 and 2015. The legal battle that culminated in the 2022 trial was the longest and most complex in U.S. corporate history. Federal prosecutors charged Purdue and 3 members of the Sackler family, Richard Sackler, the company's former president, and his cousins, Michael and David Sackler, under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. The indictment alleged a decades-long scheme to defraud doctors, insurers, and patients through false advertising, deceptive labeling, and a systematic campaign to conceal the drug's dangers. Over 70 witnesses took the stand, including former Purdue sales representatives who described target quotas that rewarded doctors for prescribing the highest possible volumes, and whistleblowers who testified that internal data showed a 30% increase in addiction rates within the first 2 years of OxyContin's launch. The trial's turning point arrived when former Purdue executive Jonathan Bixby took the stand and read aloud a confidential internal report titled, "The OxyContin Abuse Potential." The document, dated 2000, warned that the drug's extended-release formulation does not prevent abuse and, in fact, may encourage it by creating a false sense of security. Bixby's testimony, paired with a damning slide deck used in sales pitches that labeled the opioid a safe, non-addictive medication, left the jury with little doubt that Purdue's leadership had knowingly misled the nation. On June 26, after 3 weeks of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all 31 counts, including conspiracy to defraud the United States and multiple counts of wire fraud. The Sacklers were ordered to forfeit $1 billion, and Purdue was sentenced to a decade of probation, a $4.5 billion fine, and a permanent ban on manufacturing opioids. Though the family's personal assets remain largely shielded behind a maze of trusts and offshore holdings, the verdict sent a clear message: corporate greed that fuels public harm will not be tolerated. In the wake of the trial, the fallout rippled through the pharmaceutical industry and the broader legal landscape. Several states accelerated their own lawsuits, demanding billions in damages to fund addiction treatment and prevention programs. The Sackler family, already under intense public scrutiny, faced a wave of protests that forced museums to remove their name from galleries they had funded for decades. In 2021, the family announced the dissolution of the Sackler Trust, a charitable foundation that had poured over $500 million into art institutions worldwide, in an effort to distance the name from the scandal. Yet the crisis persists. New synthetic opioids, such as fentanyl, have filled the void left by OxyContin's decline, and overdose deaths continue to rise. The legal victories against Purdue have spurred calls for stricter regulation of pharmaceutical marketing, greater transparency in drug approval processes, and a national reckoning with the ways profit motives can override public health. Advocacy groups argue that without systemic reforms, the cycle of pill-pusher corporations will repeat, targeting the next generation of vulnerable patients. The OxyContin saga stands as a cautionary tale of how a single product, backed by relentless corporate ambition, can unleash a cascade of suffering that touches every corner of society. Subscribe to The Verdict for more stories like this.